So today we were going to reflect what we did in the previous recording and just talk about the way that I got introduced into ego death theory in the first place. I must say I'm very surprised at your story. It really surprises me to hear that you got into it in the order you did, of finding out about an interpretation of Rush lyrics as a first point of contact. That seems a completely kind of I don't know, idiosyncratic way of encountering these ideas. Because what the theory provides, first and foremost, is an explanation of the altered state. And for me, that's what I was looking for explicitly when I came across it. And then it was just a matter of time before kind of realizing that among the different explanations that are on offer, this one is the best and the one that seems to characterize my experience the most accurately.
So you were explicitly searching for trying to understand what was going on in the altered state of consciousness, in the intense mystic altered state, whether you thought of it in those terms or not.
Exactly. I pretty much did think of it in those terms. It felt like when the altered state came into my life in the fullest way, it very consciously felt at the time like a kind of challenge, some kind of existential challenge, saying to me, okay, you weren't expecting that, now try and understand it, see what that's all about. And then in my subsequent attempt to try and find a satisfying explanation for this phenomenon, I came across the ego death theory, and it was like, aha, yeah, Michael Hoffman has got it right. So the order that it happened for me was discovering drugs first, and then discovering the altered state.
So what led you to explore drugs in the first place?
I think that for me, ever since I was a child, I've had a kind of alchemist leaning in me. So even before I'd ever heard of what drugs are, I used to do things like cultivating carnivorous plants in my bedroom and collecting crystals and gemstones and putting them in a display, like all the different colors and everything. And I was really fascinated by chemistry and chemical reactions and that kind of thing. And then I can remember very clearly that the first time I ever heard of the concept of psychoactive drugs was in this great big newspaper special. It was just my parents' newspaper, which I would never normally be interested in reading. But it had this great big double-page spread with like a little section for each of the different drugs, you know, LSD, speed, mushrooms, ecstasy, etc., right. With a description and, you know, written obviously in typical kind of newspaper anti-drugs propaganda type way, which I didn't recognize at the time. But I was just absolutely enthralled and fascinated by this exciting, mysterious, varied, you know, really colorful sounding thing. Oh my God, there's this cornucopia of chemicals that are all strictly illegal and they're really bad, but they all do these fantastic things. Yeah. So, and that I was really, I can't remember what age, but that was young, you know, early in life. So it was only really a matter of time before I came across the real thing. And there's, do you have in America the concept of a legal high? Like, would you call salvia divinorum, for instance? Like, it's gets you high, but it's also legal.
Yeah, so at one time, salvia in most states has become scheduled and regulated at this, well, you know, illegal, I should say, more precisely at this point. But yes, so at one time it was, so yeah, we do have that, and there are still, you know, people seek out various things that they call legal highs.
That's a really big thing in England and Europe. And that was available to me to some extent, even growing up as a young teenager. But that never really made me trip and discover the altered state. It was only when I came across psilocybe mushrooms. And it was just a wonderful coincidence of timing. There's a golden age in people's lives when psychoactive drugs and experimenting is a really pertinent thing to do around age 18 and onwards. Like when a person's still young, they've still got the energy. There's a instinctive fascination to seek out altered states. So it just happened that at that time in my life, psilocybe mushrooms were fully legal in a kind of unofficial way, but it went on for many years that they were just openly available and very easy to come by. And also it's very easy. I live not far away from Holland, so it's just a short plane ride to Holland, where they've always been, you know, you can trip if you want to, like legally and easily in these places. So when I went searching for it at that point in my life, when my nature took me that way, I found psilocybe mushrooms, much as you did via cannabis. So I'd had like
Right.
a lot of experience with cannabis before I ever really tripped, and I think my earliest. In fact, my earliest drug-induced control loss, well, I suppose, first of all, alcohol, but then also cannabis. Like I had a couple of times where I really freaked out and had panic attack on cannabis.
Yeah. I mean, that is something we kind of glossed over in talking about my own experiences. Is that, I've experienced that as well with cannabis.
You have, right. You mentioned some of that, yeah, but you kind of got straight to the more exciting part of LSD. But, it's kind of like a young person's entheogen to dip your toe in the water of control loss for the first time. That's a pretty good, gentle introduction. It was only really when mushrooms came into my life that it started to feel very significant and, influenced my thinking in a very significant way. And, I became fascinated by the mushroom altered state, especially the visual aspect of it. I was really interested in it, trying to kind of find books to read about it and that kind of thing. But then I had what I would say was the first really significant experience in my life. It was this friend who I didn't know him particularly well, but he was very kind of into the same, into tripping a lot. And he came round one evening and just randomly decided to bring a load of mushrooms that he had just grown, and just shared them out between me and him. And then something happened to me in that experience, which was quite, I would say, Groffian, knowing what I know now.
You mean Stanislav Grof? I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing his first name correctly, but the psychoanalyst.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that your main familiarity with the different theorists in the field comes via Michael Hoffman anyway, right? So you must have heard him writing about Stanislav Grof.
Yes, yeah.
He employs the metaphor of birth, being born, very heavily. And he puts that central place in his theorizing, even taking it very literally.
Yeah, that somehow the altered state experience is a reflection of or informed by latent memories of the birth process. Is that a way to characterize his theorizing?
Absolutely. And furthermore, he created a very systematic description of the various stages of the birth process and what the fetus is experiencing in each of those stages. And then he mapped those onto the stages of a bad trip and what he calls it a psychospiritual death and rebirth. He also frequently uses the term ego death. So I had an experience that's very easily interpretable in those kind of terms because it was like going down a magical tunnel. I was thinking to myself at the time, this is completely amazing. My life is never going to be the same again now that I've seen this. So, something like that. It was the first kind of sense of like a life-altering, life-changing experience. And then I came down and ordinary life went on, but it was there in my head at this point, and it really fired up my fascination with psychedelia. But what made it really stick was the fact that like a week later, that friend died in a car crash. I never saw him again, except when I was tripping, and he left in the morning.
Wow.
And so it all just felt very kind of synchronous and meaningful, especially in light of kind of ego death, to interpret things as a metaphor for dying.
So that shared, did his passing away and that shared experience you had, did that kind of, I don't know, did that further inspire you then?
It wasn't, the death really wasn't that big of a thing, to be honest. It just, the whole thing, it was more the trip itself really, but it just was very, very significant. And it became more of a central focus in my life at that point. I really started to take tripping very seriously and thinking, oh my God, there's this powerful magic here because of this one experience. So then I kind of embarked on what Michael Hoffman has characterized as mushroom exuberance. Very kind of foolhardy attitude of, I need to trip, I need to maximally explore this fantastic new realm that I've just discovered. And with shops selling mushrooms just around the corner, that wasn't difficult. So I kind of went into a phase of my life where I was tripping like at least once a month. having all these beautiful, fantastic, visionary experiences, but I was still kind of pushing and wanted to discover more, wanted to kind of break through more. And I must say, I naively thought at that point that I was pretty much immune to having a bad trip. And I think I even posted about that on forums. I thought like, oh, hey man, you know, you just need to chill out and relax. If you think you're having a bad trip, it's just because you're being paranoid, you know, just you're weak-willed or whatever. Anyway, kind of naive way of thinking about it. And then the one experience that really kind of nailed it for me, what I would call my ego death experience, it happened on this day because the American president, George Bush, was visiting England at the time. And so there was this great big kind of left-wing anger and consternation about this guy being treated, you know, really well, coming over. And being young and naive, I took part in this. I went down to this big demonstration in the centre of London, and very symbolically, although it was a long time before I realised this, the culmination of this demonstration was they had erected a gigantic statue of George Bush in this square in the centre of London, and then they pulled it down at the critical moment and then ripped it to pieces.
So the protesters had both set it up and ripped it down as part of the demonstration.
Exactly, it was all part of the big thing, and they left the statue just standing there while all these people were talking, and it all got very high energy, high octane vibe. And then at the climax of it, they tore it down, which is obviously very symbolic. There's mythological stories where statues have crumbled and collapsed. So it was a very exciting day, and I went home that day, you know, had a really great time, and I just thought, okay, I want a trip tonight. This is a really good night to trip. And I took Syrian rue and magic mushrooms, right? Now, have you heard of Syrian rue?
I have, yeah. It's kind of do people describe it as an ayahuasca analog?
Yeah, exactly. Benny Shannon has written about Syrian rue as the kind of Middle Eastern version of ayahuasca that the ancient people were tripping on. It's an MAO inhibitor, but it's like you can take DMT with an MAO inhibitor to make it work in the first place. But if you take mushrooms with an MAO inhibitor, it just acts as a potentiator.
Right. So I'm just curious, did you feel that your attitude at the time, that you were kind of immune to bad trips, do you think that this, so did this lead you to be, I don't know, taking stronger doses and things like that?
Yeah, I don't know about stronger and stronger doses, but I'd taken a lot of high dose mushroom trips up to this point and had consistently pleasant, wonderful, visionary experiences, sometimes very intensely visionary. You know, the whole room, you know, exploding in colours and whatever. But it had never been any kind of negativity or beyond very, very minor discomfort about, you know, sometimes the transition from the ordinary state to the altered state is kind of rough at first, but nothing too bad.
And had you combined Syrian rue before with mushrooms? Before this event?
No, I hadn't. This was the first time I had done it, and so far, the only time. And actually, to give the full background of that, there was this one really good mushroom shop not far from where I lived, and it was set up, the guy had a whole wall covered in different plants in little pots, but it was mainly about selling mushrooms, and one of them was Syrian rue, and I bought it off this guy because I had heard of it. I knew that it had that effect on mushrooms from reading about it. And the guy advised me at the time, don't do that. That's a bad idea. I don't want to sell this to you. If you want to trip harder, take more mushrooms. Don't go messing around with using an MAO inhibitor. But that attitude that I had built up of foolhardy, I'm immune to a bad trip, this is just a wonderful, splendid thing that I can take infinite pleasure from, you know, that kind of attitude, fed my curiosity for wanting to take an MAO inhibitor with mushrooms. So I had it in my possession for quite a long time before I had actually decided this night came along. It just felt like that night was a particularly good opportunity to do it because the vibe of the day had been so good. My thought was like, what could possibly go wrong? You know, after such a wonderful day, seeing this enormous statue ripped apart, like,
yeah, we're toppling the, you know, the great evil leader, the oppressor.
Exactly. At the end of a long procession, they had all the protesters had walked already about 3 miles before they got to the square where the statue was set up. So a perfect analogy for the course of a lifetime, snaking world line leading to ego death.
Yeah, right, the parade route.
So I took Syrian ruin mushrooms, and it was just the most horrific, hideous, bad trip I've never had a trip as bad as that since. But it completely changed my relationship with tripping, and it's like I thought that my life had already been transformed by tripping at this point, by these positive experiences.
Right.
But I had underestimated the nature of kind of what transformation did. I feel that this bad trip I had really it cut me to a deeper level, and it's led me to the conclusion that bad trips in general, often, if they're safely handled, are generally more psychologically transformative than good trips. And that is something that is reflected by a number of writers, including Stanislav Grof.
So can you recall what made that trip so intense and so bad? The specifics of what was going on.
It started off really nice and calm and peaceful and getting very colourful and beautiful, but it carried on getting stronger. And there was a distinctive point when I had this profound sense of familiarity or déjà vu, where suddenly the visual quality of the experience suddenly took on a distinctly menacing or kind of evil vibe. And at that point, I thought to myself, my inner narrator of my thoughts said, oh, I'm about to have a bad trip. This is what a bad trip is like. And that was right at the beginning. And then just from then on, it got worse and worse.
Like there was no escaping that thought at that point.
Right. Once you've decided that that's the case, that you're going to have a bad trip, then combined with the intense altered state, that's a really hard, you're in for a rough ride after thinking that. And in particular, I was on my own. I had gone home alone, and one of the last things I did was try and call my girlfriend, but she was asleep. She didn't pick up the phone. So I was completely alone. And I had thought to myself, okay, I'm about to have a bad trip, etc. And then I did exactly what Terence McKenna tells you not to do when you feel this particular feeling of, oh shit, what have I done? I'm starting to trip out, which is to assume the fetal position and just curl up.
I wasn't aware that he recommended against that specifically. That's interesting.
Right. He says, don't do this. He says, when you feel this feeling, the thing to do is the opposite of that. Kind of chant or sing or bang a drum or something like that. Sit up straight in your back. That was his advice. But I didn't even know who. I think I was vaguely aware of his name at that point. I had zero idea of Michael Hoffman's ideas at this point. As far as I'm aware, I didn't. Even if I had maybe seen his website in search results, I think I might have come across it. I had no understanding of the theory.
Right.
So in particular, I had no understanding of concepts like divine mercy and compassion, praying to a higher control source. For me, that entire experience was just characterized by dread and despair. But I suppose to go chronologically, so I one of the early things I did was just curl up in a ball and think, I just need to ride this out. This is going to be as bad as it's going to be. And then from that perspective, curled up, on the inside of my head, it just got more and more intense. And, one thing I was asking you about suicidal ideation. That was a very big part of it.
Really?
And Michael Hoffman has written about suicidal ideation in trips. I wanted to kill myself. I thought, there's not going to be any other way out of this other than somehow ending my bodily life. And I thought of completely outrageous, what I now recognize to be completely outrageous. At the time, I was thinking about jumping out the window, but it was like a first floor apartment. I would have broken my legs. And I thought of going and getting a knife and plunging it into my ribs, but you wouldn't even get through your rib cage. It would just hurt a lot and make your problems a lot worse. But I didn't even. It was only a thought, and I think Michael Hoffman has written a lot about that, about how it can be, you can prove your allegiance to controller X just by thinking about committing a disaster rather than actually going ahead and doing it.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like the story of what's the biblical story with Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son. I think that's one of the kind of key things Michael writes about a lot, or one of the key stories.
Yeah, I mean, my wife is Jewish, and I'm constantly encountering that story in her family, and it's unbelievable how much that resonates with me. To the thought of kind of being so close that you're fully willing to do something, but not actually doing it. You know,
Yeah.
it's like that. I just thought it wasn't like wanting to do something. It was more like, this is the only possible remaining option. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you were like fully committed to do those things. The only thing that you could do.
Yeah, I thought of other options like trying to make myself sick or trying to knock myself on the head to be unconscious. It was just a really horrible panic experience of thinking dreadful things and feeling and the overarching emotion was just being scared out of my wits, like having absolute terror, thinking, you know, oh my God. Just an hour ago, I was thinking about taking a nice recreational, colourful, beautiful trip, and now here I am thinking about, you know, the best option for suicide or to somehow completely terminate what I'm experiencing. But, you know, the one thing that I actually did do in the physical world, other than, so I tried to call my girlfriend, and then I took kind of sleeping pill, but it was one of these over-the-counter herbal sleeping pills that don't really work.
Right.
But I think that indicates something about how, you know, some element of rationality that was remaining in me, the fact that in assessing all of these different options, I kind of went for the least harmful, even though I'm pretty sure at that point I believed that I had gone fully insane. This is exactly what you described in your like big experience of like, I'm screwed. There's no viable future for me anymore. I've gone insane. I've had a realization that I'm not going to be able to forget. And it was like a desperately wanting to forget this thing, but seeing also that it's true. It's wanting to return to ignorance. I think Hoffman called it wanting to return to the stupidity field.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. No, I resonate with that. I understand that.
I just desperately wanted to undo the situation, but there was no way of undoing it. And then, you know, at some point, I think I pretty much just caved into full despair and just accepted my fate of, you know, I thought to myself, okay, so I'm going to have this bad trip until the end of time or something like that. And then phenomenologically, it consisted of endlessly flowing patterns, you know, like Heraclitus kind of image. Just nothing was solid. It was totally out of body at the peak of it. For a long period of time, I couldn't, if I would try to move my body, it'd be like, oh, there's nothing there to move. I was dissociated, but not at another vantage point within three-dimensional space. It felt as if like three-dimensional space, including my body, had never existed, ceased to exist. It had just been like a dream, something like that. Thinking that I had permanently gone mad, that I had reached the end of. It's like up until that point, I had always assumed that the end of my life was going to be my physical death. But then this experience seemed to be disproving that and saying, no, the end of your life actually was you took drugs and had a bad trip, and then you're stuck in this feedback loop forever.
Yeah, there's no escape from this, and you're gone.
So, I mean, I hope that's given a reasonably accurate impression of what that experience was like for me. That experience, unlike any other, went on to inform, you know, my identity as a person, like the identity of Max Freakout. That's what that name refers to. That's the night that I had a maximum freakout.
And so I'm curious, how did that night end? Did you know, eventually you came down, or was there some kind of trigger that helped you realize you're going to survive, or was it just kind of the passage of time as the effects wore off?
Yeah, there was a very distinctive moment. I think the trip more or less faded into almost dreamy, just endlessly flowing patterns. And then there was a very distinctive point at maybe like 6 o'clock in the morning when physical reality suddenly reconfigured itself in a split second. It felt like in the time it takes to wake up from a dream, I felt like, oh my god, I was wrong. I wasn't permanently crazy. That was just a trip.
Yeah, like you remembered that you were just tripping.
Yeah, because I had convinced myself that I wasn't just tripping. I had convinced myself this was not a trip. This is the end of everything.
Yeah, it's funny how the mind forgets that. I think I don't know as much about, I don't know how long it took for this trip to come up, but certainly when the times I've experimented with LSD, it's because LSD is quite long, usually a long time before the effects come in, an hour or so. So sometimes I would just forget that I was tripping or that I had taken anything. Then suddenly, the effects start coming on very slowly. I'm like, oh, what am I noticing here? And then I completely forget that, be kind of like locked into the experience, and kind of forget that this was actually, caused by something I had done.
So you forget that you've taken a chemical.
I experienced that a few times, yes, yeah.
But that's genuine forgetting, like as in it, because of the passage of time makes you forget about it.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to pinpoint is the sense that that the kind of coming on of the effects of the drug were so slow, I suppose, or so kind of incremental, maybe is a better word, that I would just start paying attention to those effects, but not really remembering. I become so fascinated by the effects and the slow growth of the intensity that paying attention to that would cause me to forget somehow. I don't know, this isn't making a whole lot of sense actually as I'm describing it, does it? That paying attention to the effects and then them growing more and more intense, I would slowly, become so engrossed in them that I would forget that there was going to be an ending. I would just start to think that the effects were part of my new reality as a person, Things had permanently changed. Right. I would think that there was a permanent change going on, and not that it was a temporary kind of like time-bound change.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Governed by metabolism.
Right, yeah, that's what I'm trying to express. I would, become so engrossed in the effects that I would forget that there was a metabolism, chemical-based end to them.
Except that if there isn't an end, that presents a really significant thing for your life. It means you're going to be tripping forever.
Yeah, and I think we both described that that's something we both thought to ourselves, like it's over, I'm going to be insane or tripping forever. So that really, that it sounds like in both of our cases that was an important part of this extremely intense experience, the sense that there's no end to this.
For me, like that's an absolutely crucial distinguishing characteristic of ego death as a concept is the word death means like the end of something, right? It's like when it's the end and then there's no more future. So that has to be a component of the ego death experience to become completely convinced that it's permanent.
Yeah, it's not as if all tripping leads to ego death.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't get that strong. It doesn't get strong enough to become so convincing that it's never going to finish.
Yeah, you've got to kind of like, it's got to be strong enough for you to be fully convinced. Yeah, I like that way of putting it.
Yeah, so I mean, the come down part was equally significant then, because it was like, it felt like I had been tricked, or like I had tricked myself, but it was like something suddenly stood back from me and was laughing at my gullibility, almost. I didn't hear this thing laughing, but you see what I mean? It really had the distinctive feeling of a trick that had been played on me, that I had been made to believe that I was dead, and then suddenly come to realize that oh no, that was just a trip, just a really, really convincing and strong trip. So I came back into the room and I was just able to suddenly see my hands in front of me and the room around me again. And it was like, at this point, I was still tripping super intensely. Like there was still really, really strong visuals. But in another sense, the actual ego death part of the trip was over, because I had realized that it wasn't going to last forever, and that I was on the tail end of it at that point. Mm-hmm. So it was an enormous sense of relief. It was like my life had been saved, and it felt very much like kind of a rebirth. It felt almost like everything was new, like the world had dissolved, and then there was this new world, a real sense of regeneration about it. So then the trip came down fully within a short space of time after that, and one of the things I did the following day was to go to the guy who sold me the Syrian roux and say to him, "Oh my God, mate, you advised me not to do Syrian roux and mushrooms, and I did it last night, and you would not believe what happened to me." And it was amazing the way he reacted. He used the word harrowing, which is an incredibly good word to describe that. He said, "Oh, you had a harrowing experience, did you?" So he clearly knew what he was talking about in that regard. And then he started talking about Rastafari philosophy, about how the creator's going to judge everyone at the end of time. And I don't know. I didn't make the full explicit metaphorical association to the altered state at that point. So,
right.
but I was okay again. I was like back alive. I had been wrong about being dead and being permanently insane. But I was traumatized by how bad the experience was, and I experienced very distinctive post-traumatic stress symptoms.
Really?
I was having flashbacks, always triggered by cannabis, to the extent that I had to stop using cannabis, which is like, for me, that's a big thing because I'm a pothead, and I love cannabis, but I had to stop using it purely out of fear of what would happen.
So you would find yourself, by the flashbacks, you mean you would find yourself kind of remembering and thinking about that experience on mushrooms and Syrian roux again, or would there also be kind of I don't know, experiential reminders of that?
It was partly that. It was also just simply the fact that cannabis and all drugs suddenly affected me much more strongly than they ever had before. I was desensitized, so I'd have like a little bit of cannabis, and then I'd be basically fully tripping again, and therefore in a vulnerable state of mind and liable to make connections that would start freaking me out.
Right.
Like at one point, I was under the effect of cannabis, and I suddenly had this thought: "Oh my God! Like everybody in the world is insane, and we're all just kind of pretending like we're not." I was racked with anxiety and paranoia. It's kind of this is like the symptoms of the trauma that I was experiencing. I was very preoccupied with what had happened to me. I was thinking about it a lot. I was really working myself up about it. I was thinking, am I going to go crazy? Am I just going to go mentally ill? I felt like a walking anti-drugs propaganda commercial at this point. Like, there's a girl and she hits some eggs with a frying pan. Have you seen that?
Yeah. It's classic. Yeah.
I felt like the egg. It felt like my circuits had burned out. I was a burnout. I was just this classic. I was like, oh, all those things that people warned me about turned out to be true. I've messed myself up. I'm never going to recover again. I'm an anxious wreck now. Where I was pretty good before. Now I'm just ruined. And I felt like that for some time.
So you gave up. You gave up with cannabis. So you also had you also stopped with mushrooms as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That immediately. In fact, that was one of the few kind of conciliatory things. I felt like, well, at least I don't have to do mushrooms again. And that kind of gave me some sense of control over the situation. Thinking, I'm never going to go there again. I'm never going to have to expose myself to that, because that's an act of control.
Right.
So and another very distinctive thing that actually it didn't start with that bad trip, but it started with the prior mushroom exuberance thing. Is I started to read, which I had never done before, reading for pleasure, reading about philosophy and ideas and religion and that kind of thing. And one book in particular that I came across is called Up from Eden, Transpersonal View of Human Evolution, by Ken Wilber. Do you know that book?
No, not much detail, but I've heard of it from various readings.
I mean, I think that of any writer, Wilber is closer to Hoffman than pretty much any other in terms of the shape of the theory. It's just like Wilber is the non-drug version of the ego death theory.
Really? Yeah, I'm only familiar with him from Michael's writings, from Hoffman's writings, but I've always sensed that there's just basically the amount of attention that he gives to Wilber. There's obviously, he was obviously influenced or views him as a close competitor in certain ways.
Yeah, I think Hoffman has said like Wilbur is one of the formative, along with Watts, the really fundamental contributing factors to the foundations of the ego death theory. He talks about the evolution of consciousness, but in this state of mind I was in, I read the introduction and the first part of this book, and at one point I had to literally put the book down and just stop reading because the words on the page were making me so anxious. And similarly, like I read a book by David Icke, all about September the 11th, and then there's this chapter at the end where he talks about the evolution of consciousness and how it's like a journey that you peg your stake a certain length of the journey down the road, and different people go further than others. And anyway, it really made me very anxious, really kind of giddying spiritual concepts that I was coming across.
Right.
But over time, I just kind of got used to it, and I started thinking in this way, and I started, I was very eager for information. I was eager to inform myself about what had happened. And Terence McKenna was really the kind of major early influence in my life, my thinking about these issues. Long before I ever found out about Michael Hoffman, I came across Terence McKenna because his ideas are so much more accessible and so much more publicly available and easy to find than Michael Hoffman's ideas. And that really that was a great boost to my thinking, even though from Terence McKenna I inherited certain fallacies of thought, things that turn out to be fallacies in light of the ego death theory, which I had to kind of correct. But I think that was a good early start. There were a lot of suggestive references to determinism, the nature of time, in Terence McKenna's ideas. But that was just an early precursor. And then I came across the Dopecast podcast on the internet around that time, when I was just really into these psychedelic ideas, mainly through Terence McKenna.
And I'm sorry, is this before your Max Freakout or after?
This is after, yeah. I'm not sure if I'm getting a bit lost at this stage. I've kind of I'm trying to do exactly what you did and just go on a chronological journey through my discovery, but I don't know which details are which details are relevant and which ones are not.
No, well, I mean you're those beginning readings in spirituality and evolution of consciousness and things like that, and in psychedelics literature, that's certainly relevant. And I am curious about the what led you to, when did you start? What was the inspiration behind beginning your Psychonautica podcast? Did you originate that podcast, or did you take it over from someone else? Or I'm curious about the story behind that.
I started listening to the Dopecast podcast because I'd heard... before that, I started to post on forums a lot and talk about my experiences, and that was really the first time I had ever kind of written and expressed myself in that format. And I to start with, I called myself Joe Infinity for a while, but then I changed it to Max Freakout because that just seemed like a fitting description of the experience, and that just seemed like a good name. I think that's another thing that is important to note about the difference between me and you, is I would almost, if I had encountered Michael Hoffman's ideas first, I might have called myself Cyber Disciple. It's like, I totally see what you mean by that, and I feel like I'm in the same position. But Max Freakout is a relic of the fact that I didn't know about cybernetic ego transcendence at this early stage. So Max Freakout was a kind of self-inspired name.
Sure.
But the thing about anonymity, the reason I asked you about it in particular is because I realized that at that stage I took anonymity completely for granted, and I didn't realize that I was anonymous at that point. I just was using this anonymous name because that's what everybody does on web forums. And I didn't...
Yeah, sure, that's normal practice, right? It's coming up with a name to use.
Yeah, exactly. But I didn't realize at the time, in terms of the politics of the ego death theory ideas, what freedom that was affording me. And it wasn't for some way down the line until I really realized how useful the internet is as a tool for giving you this ability to communicate anonymously. I mean, obviously that's something that Michael Hoffman doesn't take advantage of because he's got his name behind the theory, whereas for me, I've got nothing to protect, so it's kind of just handy to be able to express myself in this anonymous way. And then when I first encountered the Dopecast podcast, that introduced me to this new medium, which seemed like a really good idea of talking in audio format over the internet.
And about what year was this? I'm curious.
So that would have been about 2006, I think. And I got in contact with the Dope Fiend, the guy that runs that podcast, and expressed my interest at that very early stage at doing my own, basically a version of the Dopecast, but instead of being about cannabis, it would be about psychedelics. Because I'd read so much by that point, and I had absorbed so much information, I thought that would be a really good outlet to kind of share what I've learned with the world. But it took a very long time before I was able to... I didn't feel I had the courage to just go ahead and speak extemporaneously, into a microphone to a bunch of people I can't see. So I wasn't able to start it single-handedly, and it took KMO, the guy that runs the Sea Realm podcast. He actually started Psychonautica almost on my behalf, always with the view to eventually handing it over to me. But he took the responsibility for getting it started, getting all the intro sound effects and everything all nice, and then we did, I think, 10 episodes together, just me and him, just talking back and forth about various different psychedelic ideas, largely concerned with the practicalities of acquiring psychedelic drugs. Like I wanted to talk a lot about growing mushrooms and extracting DMT and that kind of thing. And then after the 10th episode, KMO just handed it over to me to take over fully, and from there on, it was just Psychonautica with Max Freakout. And straight away, it must have been very present in my thinking by episode 10, because in episode 11, which was the first episode I did single-handedly, I was talking a lot about Michael Hoffman's ideas.
Excuse me, so you had already encountered them at that point.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly when I first encountered it, but it was around the time when I first started doing Psychonautica. But there's a big lag between first encountering his ideas as like words on a website versus actually starting to absorb the meaning in some substantial way of what he was talking about.
Sure.
And I remember that the earliest thing that really resonated with me on egodeath.com was actually the entheogen diminishment fallacies. Because, in embarking on this great exuberant feeling of, oh my God, this is such a spiritual thing, these psychedelic drugs, I naively went and tried to kind of find other people who would know what I was talking about. And when I did that, I met this attitude of entheogen diminishment by pop spiritualists. It was very obvious thing to me that kind of there's this pernicious attitude, and I was very surprised to find that because in my naivety I hadn't factored in the prohibitionist, the effect that prohibition has on the kind of modern mentality. So I started reading in Michael Hoffman that he was actually naming these fallacies specifically in this very systematic way, and that I found very satisfying. And I think, even from the earliest stages of starting to read Michael Hoffman's writing, the thing that always really impressed me was the degree of explicitness in what he says. He's fantastically explicit, and to be able to name a specific fallacy of diminishing entheogens just seems like I was impressed with that level of detailed theorizing, and I stuck to it. But it was fairly slow progress. I mean, I can't really remember the time frame of what it, how it worked out.
Yeah, it's hard for me as well, because the ideas have become so familiar at this point that it's hard to remember exactly when did I become convinced of a certain aspect of them. When did I first encounter, I don't know, the concept of a feedback loop, and what did that mean to me? It's hard to reconstruct at this point.
Right, there's just too much detail, and it's hard to try to remember a time when you didn't know something that is now familiar to you. That's kind of very confusing. But to give a bit of a marker, I suppose, I very distinctively felt in Psychonautica 11, I was talking about the ego death theory, and then by episode 13, a few weeks later, I had Michael Hoffman on the show, and I used that opportunity as to talk to him as a way of asking him the questions that were still not quite clear to me about what the ego death theory was saying. So, I was interviewing him for the purpose of putting it on this podcast and sharing it, but I was also interviewing him for personal reasons, because I sensed that there was something very profoundly important about this theory, but it was just so difficult to absorb it when I'm just confronted with this wall of text on a website to get the central core of it. So I fashioned the questions that I asked him in Psychonautica 13 deliberately in order to clear up my own understanding and really say, what are you actually saying about ego death? Because I totally get what he's saying about the diminishment fallacies. And then really from then on, I don't know an exact time, but I got ego death theory after that, and I sensed like this is absolutely cutting edge theorizing. This is the most advanced writing in the world, and everything that I was subsequently encountering was only confirming that for me. So, for example, for a large time doing the Psychonautica podcast, I had gone to the World Psychedelic Forum in Switzerland and seen many, many talks and obtained many, many recordings. It was absolutely enormous psychedelic conference with thousands of delegates, and it was all very plush and very professional. And I thought, right, here I'm going to find out, kind of what the world thinks about psychedelic experiencing. And in particular, I came across Stanislav Grof. I went to a full day-long workshop with Stanislav Grof where he was just talking all day about his various theories about astrology and, birth canal trauma and all this kind of thing. And he's obviously a very intelligent man, very sophisticated thinking, but Michael Hoffman can sum him up in a few sentences and completely lay flat, well, this is what Stanislav Grof is saying, and this is why he's not quite up to the level of ego death theory. He's missing this point, he's taking this point too literally. You see what I mean? So yeah. Ego death theory provides a very effective tool for deconstructing psychedelic theories from other people. And it was that kind of razor sharp, always being the top trump, always one-upping the other theories that just over time, I thought, this is it. This is obviously what I wanted to do, was to understand what had happened to me in that experience that changed my life and informed my thinking so much. And here's this theory that totally, fully, satisfyingly explains, oh yeah, I lost control of my thinking that night because I had never been in control of in the first place. I was always destined to have that experience. All these kind of things that just, the vocabulary that Michael Hoffman has given me just was better than any other. So over time, I guess I was a fully fledged disciple of the cybernetic theory of ego transcendence, and I tried to include that on the later episodes of the podcast as much as I could, but again, that was still a fairly early stage of my development. And another important detail was obviously coming across your blog at some point along the line and realizing that I'm not the only person in the world. I've got a bit of company, even though most people don't know about this. There's this other guy, Cyber Disciple, who clearly knows about this stuff and is writing about it. And for a time, I consciously thought to myself, well, that's my life's goal as a writer and a person who wants to understand as a philosopher. The philosopher in me that the psychedelic experience had awakened. I want to be able to write as clearly as Michael Hoffman and Cyber Disciple do. I always held you two, and I almost think of you as equivalents, because there's a lot of insights that I got from you that I didn't get from Michael Hoffman. Like, for example, in particular, your analysis of the university system is remarkably insightful. So there were these two people who were like the figureheads of my thinking, and I wanted to learn to write the way they do and be able to fully and accurately embody the ego death theory in my writing. And then it was just a case of writing many different forums covering many different subjects, trying to whip up conversation about these ideas as Max Freakout. Sometimes I used all sorts of different names. Sometimes I have like multiple usernames on the same forum, and I do like devil's advocate, and to try and
Right.
play around with conversational dynamics. And over that period of time, I became quite proficient at writing in that way. And then at some point, I became satisfied. Okay, I've pretty much. That's it. I've become a fully fledged disciple of this theoretical framework.
Yeah, able to talk about it in a number of different settings.
Right.
And so was your inspiration for writing was directed to posting in online forums and trying to engage in conversation, or were you doing other writing as well?
So, well, I mean, parallel to this was like, this is the life of Max Freakout, but there's like the other person in my life is the one that goes by a legal name, and
Right.
he had a trajectory which has kind of gone parallel with this, and he's tried to make it in the real world, doing something, and he's had his own successes and failures. But in particular, like he went through the university system, and I went as far as I possibly could through the university system, and I got into one year into PhD researcher before the whole thing crumbled on top of that project, because it looked like the only way to succeed in that system would be to sell my soul and pretend like I had never taken drugs, pretend like I was still on the same mental, intellectual level that I was before I ever tripped. And I couldn't, it didn't seem that, the vague promise of a career in academia or some kind of teaching thing it was not sufficiently tempting for me to want to try and pursue that any further. Plus, I mean, it seemed like I wasn't able to do that. I wasn't able to pretend to be ignorant about this. All I really wanted to do in the philosophy department is talk about the philosophy of the altered state. And I very rapidly realized, I'm surrounded by people who have no idea what the altered state is.
Right, you have no idea, don't even recognize it as a significant area of interest, which is funny, just given that it, I don't know, at an early stage I just started to take seriously this idea that to have a full account of the mind and of consciousness or whatever experience of the world, you have to include the altered state. So it's funny that philosophers are not more interested in it to me.
It's completely bizarre, the situation. That Plato is taken to be the cornerstone foundation of Western thinking, and yet these modern so-called philosophers reading Plato are completely misreading, completely misunderstanding, making the most ghastly category error, interpreting Plato as if he never tripped and he was just talking about the ordinary world. I really feel, you and I have had a lot of very similar experiences in academia, and I'm really just kind of cheering you on and hoping that you can make it further than I did, because we both encountered exactly the same issues, which is the fact that this style of thinking is incompatible with ordinary state, limited thinking.
Yeah, you use the phrase category error, and that is certainly a great way to describe the problems going on in modern academia. It's just a huge category error from our perspective.
Recently, Michael Hoffman posted in the Yahoo Ego Death group from a website called Against Prof. Phil, Against Professional Philosophy.
Oh yeah, I was quite interested to read that actually, and spent some time on that website or reading those articles.
Resonated with the experience that I had in the philosophy department. Amazingly, this writer fully described what the academic mindset in philosophy is like, and I was told multiple times, if you're not a materialist physicalist, nobody will ever want to publish your writing. You just won't be taken seriously. Nobody will listen to you. And that doesn't square with where I was coming from, which is, well, I used to be a materialist physicalist when I was naive and dumb, and I'd never tripped, and I didn't realize that there was this other way of looking at the physical world, which actually kind of qualifies, physicalism in a pretty major way, and pretty much flips it on its head, and it becomes idealism. But that idealism is considered to be like a forbidden position in the modern philosophy department. You're just not allowed to. You're crazy if you really think that the world is a mental construct. So it's impossible to go up against that kind of thinking. But no, this conversation started because you asked, was I doing any other writing besides my writing on forums? And the answer to that is, yeah, I've done a lot of official philosophy writing up until the point where I was doing full on kind of every couple of weeks, I was submitting new research proposals. I was trying every possible way I could to slide altered state thinking into philosophy, and every way I did it, I was coming up against a brick wall of, no, you're not allowed to think that, you're not allowed to say that, that view doesn't get published. So I dropped out. And
really, and people were explicit about this. This view doesn't get published. Don't bother. This isn't a way to build a career, sort of.
I guess it's the disappointment of finding out that that's what a philosophy PhD is for. It's only so that you can teach textbook philosophy to undergraduates and do your research, but as long as your research is within the legitimate framework. Otherwise, you have to, there's no freedom in academic philosophy to be an independent thinker, and in particular to be an altered state independent thinker.
All right, so in your legal name life, you're trying to make a career in academia out of doing altered state philosophy and running into brick walls.
Yeah, exactly. I started off from a position of, as an undergraduate philosopher, thinking, oh, this is a great thing. This is free and open exposition of ideas. And then by the end of that experience, a completely different view of how the academic system works, which has been really bolstered by your writing, by also what I've read in that link that Against Professional Philosophy that Michael Hoffman posted. You asked me, have I ever done writing not on forums but expressing these kind of ideas? So that explains about my brief, my period of time in a philosophy department at university, where I never once did what you did and tried to explicitly talk about drugs. The closest I got, I think maybe a sentence or two here or there, I sometimes mentioned in a couple of papers I wrote, but never kind of basing an entire paper on that. I always had the idea that this is forbidden. You can't, you need to stick to what you can refer to, the appropriate academic sources. But I took a master's degree. It was called Philosophy of Mental Disorder. And part of that master's degree was about schizophrenic phenomenology, and in particular, writers like Louis Sass.
Yeah, yes, I'm familiar with one of his books, Madness and Modernism. Is that him?
Yes, and he also wrote a book called The Paradox of Delusion, which is about a famous psychotic patient from sometime in the 1900s called Schreber, really analyzing what this guy Schreber was experiencing in a mental hospital. And there's a great deal of scope in the writing of Sass to make links between schizophrenic phenomenology and altered state, entheogen-induced cognitive dissociation with certain qualifications. And indeed, there's a lot of religious and mythological themes in the kind of delusions that psychotic schizophrenic people will report about their experiences. So I kind of use that as a way to flesh out an initial research proposal, get my foot in the door of PhD research status in a good university. And then when I was actually doing the research, it's like I discovered there are two very different halves, like two different sections of the philosophy department, the religious section and the non-religious section. And the picture I ended up with is, to be in the non-religious section, you've got to be a scientific, materialist, positivist kind of attitude. And if you're in the religious part, you've got to be a Catholic. And I tried both. I tried doing both, and those were the kind of, broadly speaking, the walls that I came up with in each of those two different approaches. But it really struck me that, the last thing I tried doing, like as philosophy of religion, talking about how altered state is reflected in religious stories.
Right.
And my supervisor at that point would tell me that she was a Catholic. And she said, like, I'll never believe what you're telling me. This goes against what I believe, because she's an Orthodox Catholic. And I was thinking, when else in a meeting with a research supervisor would they be talking about their personal religious? Probably never. In no other department would that happen.
Mm-hmm.
It was a really bizarre situation and a lot of pressure, very, very difficult.
And I'm sorry, this is in a philosophy department.
This is all in a philosophy department, yeah.
Wow.
Trying to pursue a PhD, and then I dropped out. And I decided after that I wasn't, obviously it's like I'm finished with academia. I'm never going to be accepted, be able to kind of write freely in that setting, but
Yeah.
I wanted to be an independent scholar still. And I mean, I've had a tremendously fortunate life where the pressure of making money has never been like weighing down on my shoulders up until this point, at least. And so I had a lot of scope and flexibility to be able to keep this as a present focus of my thoughts, and devote a lot of time to reading and trying to understand, trying to increase the depth of my understanding, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I started kind of pursuing that line as an independent scholar after that. And I came across a couple of opportunities whilst I was doing that. So there are numerous psychedelic conferences around the world. And I've actually spoken at a couple, just giving a kind of basic outline of an idea about psychedelic phenomenology. And trying to basically reverse engineer and construct Michael Hoffman's term cognitive dissociation, or loosened cognitive association, and really just build a foundation for that. So I wrote one paper about that, and I got published in a book which was published by the people who put on one of these big conferences called Breaking Convention. And I've spoken at a few different ones. So it's like there is and I have a name for myself in that field. Like, people know who I am. But that as it turns out is like the major inspiration of why I wanted to do this podcast, because I've become so intimately familiar with the way that pop psychedelicists think by going to these kind of conferences and reading their material, all these various writers.
Right. Yeah, and there certainly seems to have been in the past few years a great, flowering of writing and presentations in that kind of pop psychedelic mode.
Exactly. There's so much going on. They call it, psychedelic renaissance.
Sorry, I just have to laugh at the pretension of the name, but that's okay.
Yeah. Thank you. You've foreshadowed what I was going to say. Like, I've developed a very powerful sense of cynicism towards these people, even though a lot of them very nice people. They're so misguided, and I mean, I think that their misguidedness all falls under one major kind of banner, which is that they're egoic. Their thinking is egoic. They haven't cottoned on to transcendent thinking, which is conveyed in the ego death theory. They're trying to do what they're doing without the right tools for doing it. And it's become really very frustrating. And my last involvement was this. I went to the Breaking Convention conference last summer. I didn't apply to speak there. Nobody had asked me to. This was like the third one. And it was nauseating. I mean, I feel I've disconnected from that scene. I don't care about what the mass of people think about psychedelics anymore. If they want to catch up to where this is at, ego death theory type ideas, then that's fine. But they don't look even like they want to. I think that the major problem is it's prohibition compliance. They're trying too hard to appease the prohibitionist establishment so that they can get lucrative careers from it, and it dirties their thinking, and it means that they miss out on things and they don't think about things in the right way. They haven't, as I said, they haven't yet adopted the ego death theory like you and I have, and it really feels like you and I and a small number of other people, we're thinking at a more advanced level than this great mass of people who think they think they've got something novel and useful they're bringing to the table, but there's really very little substance to it when it's deconstructed in the light of ego death theory.
Yeah, I think you've used that phrase a few times, that the ego death theory is a powerful tool for deconstructing other theories. In addition to having its own content, it's also amazingly, whether it's the theory itself or whether it is kind of the arguing, the way of thinking and analyzing that I've learned from reading the ego death theory and just reading Michael's writings again and again. I've certainly experienced that as well. It's given me powerful tools for deconstructing pretty much anything and perceiving, it's both a tactic of describing what's worthy and relevant in someone's ideas, almost re-describing it to try to bring out the best features, while at the same time, pointing out its limitations and pointing out its limitations and flaws.
Yeah, for any particular theory, it falls short of the ego-death theory in some way, and it reaches towards the ego-death theory in some way, and it's just a question of how does it fall short and how is it reaching towards it. And you can analyze any of these psychedelic writers in those kind of terms. But it starts to feel a little bit redundant after years of doing this and years of going to these kind of conferences, fully immersing myself in that scene. I'm like, I can't be bothered with these people anymore because they don't move forwards. They're staying in the same place, whereas in the length of time that I've been participating in that scene, my thinking has moved forwards enormously. So I'm just thinking, why can't they? And I think that's the energy behind this podcast, is to try to express some of this frustration that I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have something similar with academic literature and people. I mean, that's essentially what my training is in the field of classics, right? Is in, it's not just ancient history, but it's specifically the ancient literature and interpreting it and the languages and things like that. And I had a similar experience going to conferences and just being kind of like, this is extremely boring at this point. There was a time where I was kind of excited by like figuring out how to like insert in the concepts of timelessness and the effect that has on personal self-control power, inserting those ideas into the contemporary, discourse within academia. But it's like it's just become extremely boring talking to people. So that sounds like a similar sort of thing that you've experienced, where you feel like your thinking is moving on. Other people's are kind of, they're attached to their one idea as a thinker.
Yeah, exactly.
And that I wonder, I mean, this is something we could expand on some other time. I wonder if that's related to, it certainly seems like that's related to me to one of the links in that you referred to earlier against academic philosophy, or the problems with academic philosophy. I think one of those links pointed out the impact that kind of professionalization and careerist thinking has upon philosophers, and I think that applies to thinkers in lots of other fields as well.
Yeah, careerism. That's a really good way of summing up what the problem is. They're trying to generate careers out of it rather than trying to be completely honest.
And I think I can appreciate some of the I can understand and appreciate in a way some of the stress that goes along with trying to make a career out of working with ideas. I mean, the most straightforward, obvious path in our modern Western society is through academia.
Right.
Which is usually a pretty stressful place to try to do it. So I can appreciate and am sympathetic in a way to people, but at the same time standing fully aside from them and wanting to point out, criticize and things like that. So you're saying that last year you felt at one of these conventions that your own thinking had progressed so much. I mean, in what ways do you feel that? I'm just curious in more specifics about aspects of the ego-death theory. So it sounds like from what we've discussed already is that you're primarily interested in the phase one sort of materials, like a phenomenology of the altered state and describing what exactly goes on in this kind of peak ego-death experience. Do you think that's accurate? That was your primary interest in the ego-death theory?
To start with, that was the primary interest. I wanted to understand what the altered state was. I think around the time when I did the interview with Michael Hoffman, around Psychonautica 13, my attitude towards the religion side of it was something like, why on earth would he want to have a chapter about Jesus Christ in egodeath.com? What has that got to do with anything, about whether or not Jesus Christ existed, ahistoricity.
Right.
But at the same time, that was an issue that I had never actually thought of, and I had always assumed that there was this historical person, Jesus. And I was quite surprised to find that when you look into it, that's far from clear. And then it was sometime after that, I can't remember exactly when, I guess, obviously, I questioned him in the podcast about this issue, about what's the relevance of Jesus, I asked him, what's the relevance of Jesus' historicity, and does the ego-death theory stand or fall according to whether there was a historical person called Jesus? I still don't think I quite grasped what this idea of mythic symbolism is all about at that point. But it was only a matter of time until that clicked in my head, and I think I was just thinking about about this story of Jesus. Oh yeah, he eats at the Last Supper and then he gets seized and crucified. Oh yeah, that's a bit like having a bad trip, and something kind of thought process like that. It clicked into place of wow, that story about Jesus is actually a metaphor for a trip. And then starting to think about other mythological and religious stories and realizing that they all have that same pattern. And then I discovered Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and that kind of further brought that idea into sharp focus about how really there's a common storyline underlying all of these different kind of folklore, legend, mythology, religion. All these different stories have the theme of the hero going on a journey to another world and then coming back to the ordinary world with some new insight or some new gift or ability or something. Suddenly it was like, wow, that really makes sense. And then that opened up a whole new thing that I wasn't really expecting. That was a completely unexpected kind of later bonus that suddenly appeared in my understanding of the ego death theory is, oh wow, this makes a really brilliant explanation of what religion and mythology is all about. But most importantly, religion, and even more importantly, Christianity and well, Judeo-Christian religion, Islam, all are kind of subsumed and explained by the ego death theory. I also read Frithjof Schwann's book. He's like an Islamic traditionalist scholar, and he wrote a book called The Transcendent Unity of Religion. And that was kind of like, again, confirming this theme that religions are subsumed under an overall template, which they all are shaped in this one image, which is the image of a person tripping out and being transformed by it. So then I guess the significance of that stage of theory understanding for me was it introduced me to the idea of intellectual satisfaction, which wasn't really an issue in trying to understand the phenomenology of a bad trip and determinism and what had happened to me. That it wasn't so much about intellectual satisfaction as coherence of model with experience. That was what mattered then.
Yeah, would you say that was a more personal sort of, had a real, personal significance to figure out, a personal drive to figure out the, what had happened to you?
Precisely. In fact, this reminds me of something you said in the last recording. You said, first of all, it had this significance for Rush lyrics, and then you realize it's talking about history and the world. It's got a bigger significance, a broader scope of relevance beyond just narrow issues like the meaning of Rush lyrics or the phenomenology of a bad trip. It starts to seem like a really significant, like profound bit of writing. It's already got the sense of significance and profundity just from explaining a bad trip, but then this unexpected later thing, and it's interesting that the way that you and I adopted the theory both kind of follows the same similar trajectory to Michael Hoffman's development, in that he developed the phase 1 first and then he developed the phase 2. And it seems completely improbable, doesn't it, that you work out this one theory trying to explain self-control and the altered state, and oh wow, look, it also explains religion. But it makes sense because why was self-control and the altered state such a central concern for Hoffman in the first place? It turns out the people that formulated those religious stories had the same central concern and the same set of political issues around whether to say it openly, whether to conceal it, that kind of thing. It's difficult to piece together the exact chronology.
Yeah, I remember being, sorry to interrupt, I remember being, at a certain stage, after I had heard your podcast with Michael, and then, at some stage after, I think just looking up Max Freakout online and coming across some of your forum posts and being really impressed by the amount you had assimilated, especially regarding the Phase 2 material. And that for me was a good, you're saying you took confidence from me writing about the ego death theory and my experience in academia and things like that. Well, I took great confidence from seeing you having adopted the metaphorical phase two metaphorical analogical interpretation of mythology and culture, which was, that was a great kind of confirmer that that you, who had already taken in some of the first part of the theory, had moved on also to the second part of the theory, or the phase two work. I think I remember at some point trying to direct anyone else who had happened to come to my blog to look at that. I mean, this is probably 5 years ago at this point. And I wrote some things about how you were writing and how you were, saying here, keep track of. And I think both you and Daniel Boone are kind of third member of our, inaugural class in the in the degree program. I think you were both posting at the same time at the same forum.
That was another thing. In addition to the intellectual satisfaction of understanding this unexpected new thing about an explanation for religion, it was also the increase in satisfaction of then being able to write about that and discovering new connections in mythology and having little flashes of realization about, this mythic thing. So, for example, it's not just mythology, but I see it in a lot of Hollywood movies as well. I mean, Hollywood movies are almost universally based on this mythic template. And movies like, the Terminator movies are so fantastically deep when they're interpreted on the cybernetic level and kind of machine and human and interface, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I haven't done much study of movies from that regard, just because, I don't know, it's so much time studying dead languages. But yeah, it is really remarkable how you can start seeing it everywhere in ways that, we mentioned last time the candy bar wrapper effect, where anything can seem significant, but then you find works of art that it really, it seems really clear that the creators of that are on some level intentionally weaving in the proper themes regarding self-control loss and the interaction of, machine thinking and egoic thinking.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So let's say I was asking about, so you're interested in the kind of the phase two material, had elements of, satisfaction about explaining, all these different elements of culture. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure I would say all these different elements of culture. I really primarily look at, religion, mythology.
Mm-hmm. And had you been interested in, what was your relationship with religion and mythology before beginning to conceive of them in terms of self-control cybernetics?
It was very shallow. I really didn't think it was important. I had been raised to not think that it was particularly important. Like it was never spoken about at home. Whether there was a god or anything like that. And I think at school, like a lot of my other people in school with me were kind of religious, and I always felt maybe that. That I was maybe in a minority by just not caring about whether God existed or anything like that. But I think the more important thing is that it just wasn't important to me. I didn't care about it at all. When I had that bad trip, it was like religion started to mean something to me, but not in the sense of, Jesus and historicity and whether God exists, but more in the sense of, where does the world come from? Who am I? Kind of what's the meaning of life? I started thinking about kind of existential questions that had never occurred to me before, and so I think, but that's not in terms of formal religion. That's just in terms of, that's more like philosophical questions rather than understanding what religious scripture is actually about.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I was familiar with the stories. I knew the stories. I knew a lot of stories from the Bible. I knew a lot of stories from Greek mythology. And even though they didn't have a particular significance to me, they were there in my mental repertoire, and I was able to think about them and then have this increasing sense of satisfaction that all of them make really good sense when they're interpreted as stories about ego transcendent, altered state, psychological transformation.
Right. So you began to, it sounds like you began to perceive or make sense of them, not just, kind of one at a time, but the concept that all of them are explained by these concepts.
Yeah, exactly. And realizing that this concept of transcendent unity, that it's a Platonist idea, right? That there's one form or one template that everything is modeled after. The idea of one over many. And yeah, I realized that there's only really one religion, which is cybernetic ego transcendence. I suppose the way I often like to think about it is you have to make a big distinction between religion in the singular and religions in the plural. And they both mean two very different things. And things like the distinction between Christianity and Islam or Judaism or whatever, that's only relevant to religions in the plural. But religion in the singular, there's no... the relevant distinction ceases to be between one religion and another, like between Judaism and Christianity. And the crucial distinction then becomes initiate versus non-initiate. Esoteric versus exoteric. So it's a wonderfully deep and satisfying and beautiful way of understanding how religion works in light of this kind of Platonist one over many. And another aspect of it is just the fact that it really makes you realize just how different that understanding is from the way that most people, the vast majority of people understand how religion works and what religion is all about. It's truly radical thinking, the ego death theory. And Hoffman has said, the aim is not to be radical for the sake of being radical, but to try to identify truth and be as accurate as possible. You need to think in this radical way.
Right.
I resonated with something that you said earlier. Michael Hoffman doesn't just tell you what you can think about religion and tripping or whatever, but he also tells you how to think about it. And he has a distinctively critical thinking and writing style. And a large part of adopting the ego death theory is about adopting that ability to critique things.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly found that, that's certainly an aspect of my long-time interest in the ego death theory, is I felt like I was really learning how to think as well. There was a certain very freeing, liberating experience of reading his writing,
Right.
Kind of like a real guiding through stages of an argument in some of the more explicitly laid out postings and pages he's written and things like that. So I resonate with that a lot.
One of the earliest forums that I used to post on, it's this London-based forum called Urban 75. And when I first did the interview with Michael Hoffman, I used to post the podcast in there every time it came out. And when I first did the interview with Michael Hoffman, I posted a thread in that forum called, and the title of the thread was Free Will, Ego Death, and Psychedelics. And it was my incredibly early, that thread provides an amazing record of my absolute rudimentary understanding of what ego death theory phase 1 was about in the earliest days of my discovery. But something very, very interesting came out of that thread, right? Because this other poster suddenly got in contact with me by private message in a state of kind of extreme emotional kind of elation, very kind of stimulated, and she was writing me hundreds of private messages saying that when she came across that forum post, ego death, free will, and psychedelics, she kind of suddenly felt like a year's worth of burden had been taken off her shoulders, because she finally understood the experience that she had had some years ago, that everybody had been telling her ever since. You just went a bit mental for a couple of weeks. It was just a mental illness. Don't worry about it. Forget about it. And she had been very depressed over the following years in being unable to integrate this powerful experience that she had had. And then it was like reading the explanation that I put of, ego death is the realization of no free will, and determinism gave her like a massive free, rush release, and her mind was transformed, and she instantly fully understood all the ideas. And we're still friends on Facebook.
Wow.
We've known each other ever since. She's a very typical classic ego death initiate. One thing that is very interesting about her is that her ego death experience didn't involve any drugs at all. It was just a combination of sleep deprivation and heartbreak. But the power of her, the way she expressed herself to me during that time, made me realize something which I already kind of suspected, which is, this ego death theory has a great power to convert people's minds beyond just my own, because I felt like it had completely converted my understanding of basically everything. Like a lot of things had pivoted in my understanding around when I adopted the ego death theory. And then here's this person reflecting the same kind of things in a very dramatic way. But that was in the very early days, and I must say, since then, that has never really happened again. I've had a couple of people that have come to me and have said that they have adopted these ideas, having heard me speak about it. But that's very rare, and it never happens with the same amount of drama that she was. But I don't know. It just kind of gave me a little boost along the way in that early stage.
Yeah, some sort of I don't know, some sort of sense that other people get what you're talking about and agree with it.
Exactly. That other people have had the same experience.
Yeah, I suppose it's important, not just the ideas, but I do think that's one thing that separates out this kind of field or paradigm from my other experiences in academia with philosophy and other concepts, approaches to things, is that the experiential aspect. There's a very much like an insider sort of outsider vibe to to the paradigm in a way. That it is directly connected to one's own mental experience of one's own consciousness, and not just kind of, let's combine a few ideas and see if we come up with something, no matter whether it coheres with experience and with the truth, as you said earlier, and things like that.
Right, it's rooted to the experience.
I'm just recalling a few things in my own, progress of understanding the ego death theory and coming to adopt it, but some of Hoffman's both podcasts and writings about, the basic thing I've always thought of is like, if you give drugs to someone, no matter what culture they're from, they will trip out. They will have loose cognitive associations. And that was such a helpful kind of clarifying thing to grasp onto, because, certainly in my experiences in academia, the reigning kind of interpretation is that, people from different cultures have such different, the most radical form is that they have completely different brain views and completely different, they're completely almost alien people from different cultures, and that there's no commonality across cultures, basically. All that is just a projection by someone comparing cultures. But having that sort of, there's some sort of like chemical just foundation that like if you give someone LSD, they will trip out, And so there is this sort of like commonality across the human experience. That's something I came to believe in and agree with, that even if it's the altered state is experienced or expressed in different ways depending on culture, the kind of the mechanisms, I guess, of the altered state are the same.
Exactly, loose cog. So I think I've pretty much done as far as I can the same as you, like covered the whole story. I think there's little things that are coming to me that I might have left out and whatever, but it's given a pretty good indication.
Yeah, of where you came from. So yeah, it seems like, so you were inspired to seek out, just let me sum up and see if I understand. You were, inspired by your own kind of experiences with the altered state, including one significant bad trip, Max Freakout. You were inspired to look into explanations of the altered state to try to figure out what had happened. And in the course of that, you encountered the ego death theory and decided that it made sense as an explanation, realized that it made sense as an explanation for what had happened to you. And then over the course of reading more about it, you discovered kind of intellectual satisfaction, coherence, and a certain amount of sense that it could help or affect people in a positive way.
I don't know about affect people in a positive way.
Right.
That's starting to sound like kind of psychotherapy speak.
Yeah.
I hate this word benefit that is always coming up when people try and talk about psychedelics. Oh, there's this amazing experience, so it has to have some kind of benefit for everyday life. It's like, well, where does that logic come from? And there is certainly something intrinsically good and awesome and cool about it, but you need to be careful in talking about benefits, or did it heal you, or is it positive?
Yeah, because that's certainly an always kind of debatable perspective. From benefit to whom, from whose point of view.
Yeah. And I think it's what I come down to. I said, like, how all of the problems with that paradigm can be it's just because it's egoic. And I think that whole idea of benefits, that's egoic. Does it benefit ego? Does it benefit
Right.
my ordinary state self-identity?
Yeah, when in fact there's nothing, it doesn't affect kind of the deterministic universe. It doesn't, from the point of view of the deterministic universe, it doesn't matter whether you are benefited by it or not. But nonetheless, but there's some, I guess what I'm trying to put my finger on is there's some sort of intellectual coherence or relief, maybe, from coming to understand these ideas.
Yeah, exactly. A sense of this theory has it figured out. This is a good theory, and it's cutting edge, and it's good to be at the cutting edge. It feels, satisfying and like some progress has been achieved in kind of coming to understand things in this way, which feels so far beyond and ahead of the ordinary kind of understanding.
Yeah, it also makes sense to kind of attach yourself to it in that way. That there's this excitement to it.
Yeah.
Great. No, thank you. That helps me a lot. That helps me understand where you're coming from and your background with it. I'm curious, basically, if you could sum up more what your experiences have been like. And you started to do this a little bit with the person who wrote to you right at the beginning. Your experiences, especially on online fora, trying to present or drum up conversation about ego death theory and related topics. What your experiences have been like doing that? Has that been satisfying to you? Has it been frustrating? I'm not talking about the academic side and your public persona, but specifically on the web.
Max Freakout, basically.
Yeah.
It's been a mixed bag of things have come out of that. The first thing to mention is a very low amount of conversion rate or take-up rate that I actually know about. I can hope that there's people that have read my writing that I've never had any contact with who might have, in inverted commas, benefited from it. But really just two people have kind of, I felt that I have been able to share with them the satisfaction that I feel within me in a way that makes me satisfied that I've effectively shared it. These two people. And the second one was some years later in a thread that you actually contributed to on the psychonaut.com forum. And there's a poster on there called Strange Loop. And he made a lot of contact with me after that and saying that, he'd really kind of felt a profound resonance with these ideas and wanted to take it further. So there's those two kind of, I guess, success stories in terms of being able to convey to another person how great it feels to understand things in this way. But in aside from that, very repeated, failure. I feel like all I ever end up doing in those kind of discussion forums is endlessly clarifying the same old things over and over again, and people come with the same misunderstandings that fail to connect with and see the things that the clarifications that I'm saying. So then I keep trying to clarify in the most clear and explicit. Again, it comes down to what I was saying earlier about trying to emulate you and Michael Hoffman in being super explicit writers. And my theory is something like Plato, Platonic idea of the ultimate triumph of reason over ignorance, that clearly enough expressed reason ought to be powerful enough to show a person, what the coherence of these ideas. So I'm trying to find that level of razor sharp clarity that I can express myself more effectively and kind of have be able to be understood and accepted by other these posters more. But it's an endlessly uphill struggle, and it's always the same exact misunderstandings, which are always egoic thinking. That's what it always comes down to. Like, meditating can make you trip if you just do it long enough. It's every bit as good.
Yeah, maybe.
It's like you end up wasting your life. Or, with other things like... Well, of course, Jesus existed.
Yeah, that's certainly when I...
Was that, sorry?
I was going to say, I was just going to chime in that I agree that, thinking that way about meditation was I don't know, powerful part of my thinking, and I do encounter that on a daily
Right.
basis in my life. People people just talking about meditation or drug-free meditation techniques or other related things, and it's just like
Hold on to your left nostril.
yeah, it's like I don't know, it's just really or people using it who aren't even interested in the altered state, and I try to explain to them what the altered state is. Even in my personal life, and they're kind of looking at me cross-eyed, like, what do you like? Who's interested in that? Like, well, isn't that what you're trying to do with meditation anyway?
But the logic that it comes down to is this blind insistence that ego alone ought to have the tools that it needs to attain transcendence. It shouldn't need any external thing to come and defeat it. I think that's the implicit thing that people are saying. But from my point of view, if you fail to distinguish between the experience of meditating sober and the experience of tripping, then you fail to isolate the experience of tripping and see it for what it really is, which is loosened associations. Because you never get loosened associations in any strong, significant sense from meditating, it blinds you to that crucial distinction between loose and tight cognitive association binding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like your postings online. I mean, you've encountered a lot of, I don't know. I mean, would you say there's also a large amount in online forums of just kind of social posturing, like a lot of the arguments are more driven by social concerns or about presenting a certain image of the posters trying to present a certain image of themselves than it is by, I don't know, trying to engage with the ideas.
I don't know. I wonder. It's like you've asked me a question, like what motivates these people to say to talk to post the way they do and to respond to me in the way they do. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
It doesn't make sense to me. Why should it be that there's just this tiny number of people like me and you who it's obvious. It's completely second nature to us to recognize that. The coherence of these ideas, but why doesn't everybody else get it? I don't know, and I continue to be driven to try to find satisfying communication with people, and I continue to fail in that endeavor. But I just go on because it's like I don't know. I suppose. Because part of it is that my power of exposition has increased, and I've felt it increasing as I've had more practice in writing about these ideas. And I think people's blunt ignorance and failure of recognition has strengthened me in the way that it's made me want to be clearer. And that's the satisfaction that I get from it is the feeling of progress that I make in becoming a clearer thinker and a clearer communicator.
Yeah. No, I mean, just as a outsider to that, I've certainly observed that from reading your writings and admired that in the online postings. I mean, I've never dipped into those waters as much for some reason, and perhaps I should do more so. I've just kind of, mostly just kind of ignored other people and gone on writing what I wanted to write. But I do recognize that. I don't know. I don't necessarily feel as confident in entering into those forums, basically.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, that's interesting. The style that you have adopted is very similar to Michael Hoffman's style, which is like irrespective of other people, irrespective of interpersonal communication, and is just prose. You're just kind of writing prose. And I've not found much motivation to do that. Like the paper that I said I got published by the group that do the Breaking Convention conference. That was me. That was an example of me kind of writing something where there's nobody responding to me, and I'm just trying to kind of say the way I see it and put these ideas in my own words and in the way that corresponds to my own introduction to it. But that's minimal. That was like once I'd written that one paper, I kind of thought there's nothing else I need to say in that format anymore.
Right.
And then I think that maybe, hopefully, what's happening now is, I'm trying out a new avenue of communication, which is very different because now I'm interacting with someone who actually gets it, who actually knows what I'm talking about and knows why I think the way I think. And this is very different. It's a completely different. This feels very satisfying, but in a very different way. From I don't feel like I'm trying to. I'm obviously not trying to convince you of anything. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I guess it
Right.
just feels like we're getting to know each other and seeing about our respective styles and respective angle on this thing. But the core of it, we both agree on.
Yeah, certainly, and certainly I agree. And I've, it was something you just said about like not being satisfied after you wrote that one kind of academic paper that was published, and then not being as satisfied. That really, that really resonated with me. That I think some of my own, I don't know, struggles to get done with my program, even though I'm in the final stages, or it's partly a lack of motivation because I feel like I've written, I've written in class papers and other presentations and things like that. I've like done this already, done this style
Right.
of trying to make the ideas, subversively including the ideas into, establishment style academic prose. And, the motivation to do that is kind of lacking right now. Though I'm trying to apply all these other sorts of pressures, social pressures to myself to get get it finished. But, so that's one reason I've been enthusiastic about this collaboration as well is just as you said, trying out something new and, actually engaging more directly with someone who also gets these ideas. I've never really dived into forums. I've just been writing on my own, but I think I think that there's a lot of benefit that I could receive from this, essentially benefit, so to speak, in that word. But just like benefit to, as I wrote, I think in an email, benefit to the sort of content and motivation to produce different sorts of content.
Exactly. So it's nice that we both share the feeling of struggling to find motivation, and we both also share the positive motivation that this new medium has afforded us.
Yeah, because I think like the sort of topics that we're talking about, discussing the kind of pop psychedelia as it stands in 2016 is that sort of project and really benefit from this sort of conversational back and forth.
Right. I feel like kind of nagging suspicion that I haven't been systematic enough and that the story I wanted to explain I haven't gotten across. But I think maybe that's just me. That's just my kind of insecurities about clarity.
It seems to make sense to me.
I mean, that's the important thing, I suppose. So you get a sense of where I'm coming from.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I tried to summarize it earlier a little bit.
That was a very accurate summarization of it. I mean, there's a couple of things I haven't talked about. My continued relationship with the altered state, which is, I suppose it's not even that interesting because it's just a matter of endlessly confirming to me. I mean, tripping is still a hugely something I'm so fascinated by and so in awe of and whatever. And I think when you've got the familiarity to ego death theory plus years and years of experience in tripping, you can really kind of you can have some fantastic experiences. Really kind of with the combination of understanding and direct experience. Ability to combine them both together.
Right. Yeah, and kind of like armed with that. Having gone really far out there, I guess, that you can kind of, be aware. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the right analogy. It's like you've like surveyed the terrain and gone and explored the terrain enough that, stuff is less.
It's not completely surprising anymore.
Yeah, it's not completely surprising anymore. Though nonetheless still capable of, momentous experiences.
Exactly, yeah. It never becomes boring or trivial. It's always like a big undertaking. It feels like the prospect of doing it feels to me like the prospect of going mountain climbing or something. It's like a huge undertaking to do a high dose experience, but it's always really kind of enriching and inspiring afterwards. I'm just struggling to think of anything that I haven't said, and I'm just going to try and edit this all together in the most kind of flowing way that I can.
Yeah, well, I think we did a pretty good job of sticking generally chronological. I mean, it sounds to me like that. But if you don't want it to be chronological, don't feel, I don't think it has to match my presentation, which was, I've just written about it, enough times, formulated it enough times in writing on my blog that I tend to think of it in those terms. And for some reason, I was motivated to, I think, I was motivated to especially write about my kind of first introduction to the ego death theory because of, partly in some ways because the blog was constructed at a time, began at a time, and this was so focused on metaphor that I realized, like, reading it, you might have the impression that I don't care as much about the phase 1 material, when in fact it was extremely, personally relevant and important to my experiences as a, young person kind of struggling with figuring out how my brain works and how my self works and things like that. So I was kind of motivated to go back and remember those times and kind of plot out a trajectory of understanding the ego death theory to kind of correct that.
But in using Michael Hoffman as an intellectual model or guru or teacher or something, I do sense there's something important about being accurate about that, because he has gone to an enormous amount of effort to carefully chronologize that early stage of his development of the theory, and then you have followed him in doing that. So it does kind of feel like a project worth doing for me.
Yeah, maybe it would be worth writing, just jotting down dates and things like that. I was going to offer too, if there's things that, if there's things that you feel you want in writing, we can host them on my website under your, I could create like a ability for you to post there or something like that.
Oh, that's really good of you. Yeah, I've thought about that before, actually, about because I've sometimes used the comment section just in your blog just to kind of say ideas that have come to my mind about what you've written. But yeah, okay. I wonder if that would happen, like if I would ever be motivated to write. But we'll see. But it's nice to know that the option is there.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if we want to make it, because the one problem with the website is that things get lost in the comments, I think, and some really interesting things have been posted in the comments by you, Daniel, Michael, but those don't appear on the search. I mean, in the past, I've tried to draw attention to comments in the main postings, but. So anyway, the point is, if we want to elevate something to the status of like a full-on posting, that would kind of supplement one of our episodes, we could do that, basically.